I will warn you ahead of time that I found a book online in the Upper Austrian State Library about the Arras offensive from the German point of view the day before yesterday. So I rejigged a whole bunch of stuff that I've to include what I found. So hopefully I won't run wildly over time, but somebody will give me a shot if I'm about to do that. So here we go. What I want to do today is tell you a bit of a story that where I think you're quite familiar with the other side, but we're not usually in Canada as familiar with the German side, even though Vimy Ridge is a battle that has really marked our public memory. It's maybe something that part of the public memory that motivated you to be part of the Western Front Association group. It's something that motivated me to apply to be a tour guide at Vimy. So Vimy is this huge thing in our public memory. And yet, I think partly understandably, but still very interesting from my point of view, we sort of ignore half of what happened at Vimy, right? So what's going on the other side of the barrels of the CEF guns, right? There's a whole lot of things happening there. And that's the topic that I've gotten interested in. And so that's why I try to, put a little twist here and add Vimy-Höhe, which is the German word for Vimy Ridge. It's the Vimy height, which is a part of the Arras battle, as you know, which in German they call the Osterschlacht bei Arras. So the Easter battle near Arras. I haven't done a whole bunch of original research in the archives. For me, it's about finding anecdotes, finding personal accounts that are going to make a difference, that are going to bring that different perspective, whether they're in something that was published in the 1920s, and I'll talk about that in a moment, or whether they've been unearthed by somebody else. I chose the title today, Doomed Youth, because I want to try to connect this German experience that I'm going to talk about to what we know, what we're more familiar with. I think we all know the poem, the Wilfred Owen poem. He never says it's only about the British, but naturally we associate what he says in that poem with them. And so maybe after today, we'll have a bit of the German experience in mind sometimes as well. Obviously, in the amount of time I have today, I'm not going to try to be super complete. I'm going to try to give you a bit of an overview of what is going on for the Germans at Vimy, and then delve into a few individual cases and testimonials from survivors, which are kind of interesting, I find. And of course, in doing so, I'm not trying to, advocate for the Germans or convince you should become, partial to the German cause in the First World War. It's not about that. I think for me, it's really about that human experience. If we think about the site at Vimy today, which here it is in all its glory last year when I visited for the first time since I was a tour guide, understandably, the Germans are not that present there. So not only in our minds are they not always as present, but even physically at this site, they're not that present. Again, for understandable reasons, right? When I was a guide there, I decided to throw this in as a little connection. I was lucky enough to meet some of the last living British veterans of the First World War, like Arthur Hailstrup here. But unfortunately, I never met a German veteran of the First World War. And maybe that's one of the reasons why I wanted to balance that out in my own readings and my own interests. So here we've got another site pick to get us into the mood here. Yeah, I think we all know this map as well. It's another familiar part of the Vimy story, of that historical imagery that kind of impresses itself into our minds. But the Germans aren't on it either, right? We can certainly see where the Canadian divisions are, where those little objective lines are, and so on. But the Germans aren't there either. They're on other maps, of course. But this is one of those classic maps. It's the official one, and so on. And they're not there either. So where I went looking for some of the stories I'm going to talk about today is German literature that was published during and after the war, especially in the 1920s. After 1933, obviously things get a little more complicated when it comes to published works. So books like these, which you can maybe see them, some of them, on the shelf behind me there over my shoulder. One is a history of a Bavarian infantry regiment, the 6th Infantry Regiment, which was present at Vimy. And the other, the green one here, is a sort of semi-official German history put out by the German Imperial Archive in the 1920s. And there are 2 volumes on the Arras offensive, and this is the first one that I just scanned in for fun. Thankfully, having lived in Vienna, I speak and read German, and I taught myself to read this type of script that they used at the time, Frakturschrift. So hopefully that'll result in a few interesting finds. And here are a couple of others. The one which I think should be on your right is the one I stumbled upon digitized in the Upper Austrian State Library 2 days ago. So 350 images, a few of which I've included today in our store, in this presentation. So I want to start in, I guess, a kind of a journalistic style, right? Where you have the upside down pyramid, where you start big with the context and you go in small. I'll say a few words about Germany's situation, strategic and political situation in early 1917, when the battle is kind of on the horizon. They're in a tough spot because, as this propaganda postcard kind of reflects, right? You have a weaker Central Powers alliance facing a stronger Allied alliance. They've had some success in the first part of the war, but now the whole attrition factor is starting to take its toll. Now, of course, on a postcard like this, you can portray Germany and Austria as a lot bigger and stronger than the 7 Allied powers that are depicted here. But that's only going to get you so far when the rubber meets the road on the battlefield. Now, most Germans generally still support the war effort, but they are suffering. And one of the reasons the home front is suffering, of course, is the Allied blockade. And this is a picture in Berlin of what the Germans call a goulash cannon, which basically means a portable field kitchen, serving soup in the street in Berlin. And of course, the winter of 1916-17 in Germany was known as the turnip winter because they had a shortage of potatoes, so they had to eat more turnips, which are considered less nutritious and so on and so forth, and often used at the time for livestock feed. So they've just had this awful winter. The country has just become a military dictatorship. In fall 1916, right, Hindenburg and Ludendorff take over. The civilian government is kind of pushed to less relevance. This propaganda poster is another example of how dire things are getting on the home front, because it's encouraging people to collect, what's the word in English now? To collect fruit pits in order to squish them and get a little bit of oil out of them to replace the normal sources of vegetable and animal oils and fats that are in an extreme shortage. So you know, if the main member of your alliance is squeezing peach pits or whatever, or cherry pits to get the oil out of them to eat so people can get calories, you're in a bit of a tricky situation, let's say. And so the response of the authorities is twofold. On the one hand, they adopt this idea of durchhalten, so holding out. And this propaganda postcard that I found at a flea market in Vienna is a bit of a symbol of that. It says, "We stand like iron," right? With this kind of medieval noble knight wearing iron armor. I mean, tell that to a housewife who doesn't have enough food to feed her kids. I'm not sure she would be super impressed. But that is the official mood on the home front. The official message is, we are holding out no matter how difficult things are. They also make some radical decisions in the war because they're feeling desperate, right? So on the one hand, they've taken all sorts of terrible losses on the Western Front in 1916, on the Somme, at Verdun. They're having trouble maintaining the quality of the army. And the High Command actually admits that an outright military victory on the Western Front is probably not possible. On the Eastern Front, there's been the Russian Revolution in February 1917, but the provisional government, the Bolsheviks don't take over right away, right? So there's a provisional government that comes that wants to create a democracy, and they also want to continue the war. So this is not quite the revolution that Germany was hoping for. That will come, but after Vimy in October. So things are tricky, and they decide to take a huge risk and launch unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917. And of course, they want to convince people it's going to work. So they put out a poster like this one called England's Not, which basically means England's need, England's crisis. And they're showing all the ships sunk around the British Isles by their submarines. This is very risky, brings the US into the war a few days before Vimy, but they feel their backs are up against the wall. On land, as you are probably familiar with, they decide to shorten the lines in early 1917 and withdraw to the Hindenburg Line, which you can see a bit more in detail here. And the positions on Vimy Ridge are sort of part of one of the anchors of the northern edge of that Hindenburg system, if you will. So we've got trouble on the home front. They know they're facing a stronger enemy, and they take some radical measures in early 1917 to try to remedy that. But of course, the enemy gets a vote in what happens, and the French and British are going over to the offensive in the spring. So let's focus down a little bit on Vimy, which is an important position, of course, but in April 1917, it's a supporting action of a supporting action, right? Because the French offensive in Champagne is going to be the main one, and then the Vimy is the northern wing of the Arras offensive. And the Germans have been there for a while. And I managed to buy a few and find a few pictures of the Germans at Vimy, not from April 1917. They had other things going on at that particular moment. But here's a cavalry patrol in the Vimy village, which was just behind German lines in 1914. The Germans have been in possession of the ridge for all that time. As you probably know, they almost lost it to the French Moroccans in 1915, but managed to keep it. And they've been there long enough that they're starting to put up their own memorials, like this Bavarian memorial in the village of Arleux, which is also just behind German lines, behind the ridge. They had suffered badly in 1915, stopping the French advances, and put this Bavarian Royal Lion memorial there, which is, of course, not there anymore. No surprise the French were not keen on this sort of thing after the war. Here we have a couple of pictures now from a private collection that I bought of German frontline trenches on the ridge in 1915, though. Just keep that in mind. There's a machine gun position. There's an officer with what looks like the entrance to a dugout, maybe a gas curtain or something like that. I have to enhance the picture a little bit, I think. Yeah, some observation telescopes. You can see the quality of trenches are not what you'd associate with the Hindenburg Line, right? With all the reinforced wood and so on, because this is a bit earlier in the war. And here we have, in theory, the Chancellor von Bethmann-Hollweg visiting these trenches near Vimy. But I've yet to sort of cross-reference and confirm that. Does look like him. Now in 1916, when the British are holding the line before the Canadians arrive at the end of 1916, this is what a communications trench looked like at Vimy. That's what it says here in that caption, Vimy-Höhe Laufgraben. Laufgraben is a communications trench. And the picture was taken by Gefreiter Gärtner, so rough equivalent to corporal or lance corporal Gärtner in May 1916. It appears, yeah. So now, when the Canadians arrive, of course, they don't attack right away. There's a period of whatever it is, 5 or 6 months. But nonetheless, they managed to make life for the Germans fairly difficult. There's a German sniper by the name of Manfred Gossen who gave an interview to a British researcher who was interested in sniping, the history of sniping. And this German sniper, Gossen, he was stationed at Vimy for a while in that period where the CEF was there, but before the actual attack. And he said that the German snipers didn't have a very good time in the lead up to the battle. And I have a direct quote from that interview. Gossen says, "We had the Canadians in front of us, who were the very devil. Our snipers could not shoot without retribution, and we lost many good men. We did little sniping there, as even for us old trench veterans, it was too dangerous. So even in the lead up to the battle, we can see how the CEF skill in sniping in particular is having an impact. Now, all these German positions on the ridge are better in 1917 than they were in the pictures that we just saw from 1915, right? And here we have an aerial from the Canadian archives that some of you may have seen before of the kind of density of trench networks that are on the ridge. And what the Germans want to do to defend the ridge is to use a bit of a new tactic based on defense in depth, right? So one of the problems they have in 1916 is they try to hold every trench on the Somme, for example, and they end up paying a very, very heavy price for that, and they can't keep doing that. So they reorganize, and they decide that the front lines are going to be thinly held. They're going to create more individual, mutually reinforcing strong points, like the one in this picture after the battle, where Canadians have already captured it. It's been hit by Canadian or British artillery. But these kinds of things are the new basis for a more networked defense in depth, where you allow the enemy to capture the front line position, for example, exhaust themselves as they're trying to deal with these isolated but mutually supporting strong points, and then you counterattack. And what the Germans want to do is save on their own manpower, reduce their own losses, but exact a higher cost from the Allies. Right? Here's a bit of a fanciful postcard of the time showing just how well developed and comfortable German trenches were supposed to be. And there's a nice little couplet rhyming poem about how homey and nice and safe the trenches and the dugouts are now, and so on and so forth. Again, exaggerated for home front consumption, right? We're going to see, though, that this plan doesn't quite work out for the Germans at Vimy. Not only are they not able to stop the Canadians, but they're not even able to really properly implement this plan of defense in depth. But before we get there, let us talk about who these Germans are in general. So the Germans serving on the ridge are part of the 6th German Army under this guy, General Ludwig von Falkenhausen. That's a very famous Prussian aristocratic military line, the Falkenhausen. He is pretty old at the time. He's a veteran of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And under him, the corps, if you will, the equivalent of a corps, is called the Vimy Group. And they are under this guy. And unfortunately, this is the least worst picture I could find of him in all of my searching. And he's General von Fassbender. So he's kind of Bing's alter ego, if you will, for this particular battle. The Vimy Group, or the Gruppe Vimy in German, they only have between 30 and 45,000 men. We're only talking 3 divisions here, 2 Bavarian and 1 Prussian division. Now, that is an extreme disadvantage numbers-wise, because the Canadian Corps, even though they're not all of them are going over the top, of course, at the same time, the Canadian Corps has something like 100 to 120,000 men. Many of the Germans in these 3 particular divisions are reservists, so they're almost all not part of the pre-war, not necessarily professional army, but conscript army that has already served its 1 or 2 years. These are reservists who might have had their military service several years ago, for example. The Prussian 79th Reserve Division is in the center of the line. So up in the center of the line, where today the memorial stands, for example, that whole area is defended by the Prussian 79th Reserve Division. They're under the command of Alfred von Dieterich, who wrote a very interesting account after the war, which has been translated into English, by the way. Some of you might have read it. And then there's the Bavarian 1st Division in the south, facing our 1st Division. and the Bavarian 16th Division, which is all the way up at the north, which partly faces some British units and partly faces the 4th Canadian Division near the Pimple and so on when the fighting gets going. So that's who we're talking about, basically. Now, what is the mindset? What are the Germans thinking? What are they seeing? And from what they've written, what do we know about what they're feeling in the lead up to the battle? We can see here a few shots of the ridge. I'm going to try to show you a few from the German point of view, more or less. We have to use our imaginations a little bit. This is taken after the war, but this is, the camera's a bit high up. But yeah, we're looking sort of down that gentle slope from more or less the German point of view. Here we are on the back of the ridge. So this is kind of just behind the ridge, so in the around where the German second main line would be. You can see the villages have all been destroyed, and then you have that more dramatic rise on the eastern side of the ridge behind German lines we can see here. And this is going to be a problem for the Germans. The geography of the ridge makes their lives extremely difficult. They know that the British and Canadians are going to attack. They know from observation, the German Air Force is quite good, and they're able to identify all the columns of munition and reserves coming up towards the line. So they know it's coming. And they also know, because they've captured a fair number of Canadian prisoners and trench raids and things like that. There was a big Canadian trench raid, as you probably know, that didn't go very well in March, and so on and so forth. So they are able to interrogate these Canadians, and they know that something is brewing, although they don't know the exact day necessarily up until the last moment. But the German command is worried that the position is too weak. On the one hand, of course, when you think about it, you have the high ground, and this is something that we always emphasize in our Canadian experience and memory of Vimy, is how imposing the position is, how powerful it is, right? The Germans recognize this too. That's why they set up their lines there. But they worry that the position is far weaker than they want it to be. This is a German map from the 1920s, and it shows in blue their trench positions. They've tried to implement the defense in depth as best they can. They've divided the ridge, for example, into different defensive sectors so that they can organize more quickly and easily. And the sector that I've highlighted here, mostly, I would say, there's Döberitz in the northern section, just under Givenchy. But then in the middle, you see the word Fischer. That is the central defensive zone on Hill 145, more or less where the monument stands today. The monument today is approximately where you see that big lump of blue just under the letter F in Fischer. So that's just to orient you. And the Canadians, of course, are coming from the left here, from the black trench line on the left. Interestingly enough, I just sort of pointed out how that Canadian map doesn't have the Germans on it. Well, this German map doesn't have us on it. So that kind of blind spot cuts in both directions, I think. The problem they have is that the ridge is narrow. It's especially where it's highest, it's not that deep, right? The Canadians plan to advance, what, I think 700 to 1,000 meters on the highest part of the ridge, which is right here, what we see on this map. It's not that deep. You can't really suck in the enemy when they only have 700, 800, 900 meters to go until you have that steep back end of the ridge. So the Germans are caught. They have a good position, but they can't do what they want with that position. So it's kind of strong but brittle, I guess is the best way of putting it. And of course, before any attack, right, there's a certain amount of fear in the rank and file. I think it's inhuman not to feel that. And one man who was feeling that fear, his name was Runge, a lieutenant, so Lieutenant Runge. On April 8th, he was moving up to the line, relieving another unit. And as he was moving up to the line, he crossed paths with a man that he knew by the name of Heinecke. And he told Heinecke, who survived the war, Heinecke did, that if the English attack tomorrow, This is April 8th, by the way. If the English attack tomorrow, my dear Heineke, you won't see me again. So I think we know this idea where a soldier has a premonition that this is it, that my time has come. We know it from Canadian and British anecdotes and testimonials, and the Germans are no different. And of course, Lieutenant Runge was killed by Canadian hand grenades and died of his wounds the next day on April 9th. And Heineke is the one who then reported this story after the fact. Another problem the Germans have is that to implement this new defense in depth tactic takes time. The German army is a massive institution of millions of men, and it's hard to implement change. So there are quite a lot of officers at different levels who are not implementing these changes quickly enough, let's say. Another issue is their artillery. They are weaker than the Allies as far as artillery goes, but they're especially weaker in terms of counter battery fire. So before the battle even begins, as you may know, something like 80% of the German batteries in the area are suppressed by Canadian and British artillery. Now, can you imagine an infantryman fighting with such a lack of artillery support? I mean, this is a stressful, difficult, and potentially fatal situation for your infantry if you've lost 80% of your artillery and you already had less than the enemy in the first place, right? And even of course, the Canadians would struggle in those circumstances as well, right? When we didn't have artillery superiority, for example, at Second Ypres, the infantry had a very, very tough time, obviously, and had to give ground. The Germans refer to the week leading up to the attack at Vimy Ridge as the week of suffering. In German, it's called die Leidenswoche. Leiden is suffering in German. And already this bombardment before the attack goes in has an effect, because the 79th Division, for example, right on the top of the ridge, they're down to an average about 60 men per company before April 9th comes around. So this is kind of the situation the Germans are dealing with. One little addition before I move on to the map here. If you look towards the bottom in the center, you'll see Zahnstocker Wäldchen. There's a little forest there that the Germans nicknamed Toothpick Wood, because, of course, the shells had torn all the stumps to shreds, so they call it Toothpick Wood. It's there on the map, and this is a picture of it in May 1916 as it looked from the German perspective. We talked about German artillery. Here are some examples of these kind of weapons that are being suppressed by the Allied artillery. This is a 21 centimeter, what they call mortar, near Arras. This is a reinforced artillery position after the battle. Of course, it's been captured here. And they tried to hide the guns in ruins of villages and houses like you see here. The caption says, maskierte Geschützstellung, which means camouflaged or hidden artillery position. And this is a little farther back because it's just after the battle, but to give you an idea, right? To give you a flavor of how the Germans are trying to protect their artillery from us, and they're not able to in this case. And here's a frontline trench at Vimy, a frontline German trench at Vimy, a little bit before, in February 1916. So, landed to April 9th, of course, the Germans now at this stage know it's coming. And von Fassbender puts out a kind of order of the day, as is often the case, right, from an army or a corps commander. So he sends out this order of the day early on April 9th. It's not clear how many of the Germans would have received it. And it goes like this. Soldiers, the day of the decisive assault draws near. It will demand nothing less than a supreme performance from all ranks. Be ready at all times to begin the defense. The British must not be allowed to gain one single foot of ground. So much for the defense in depth idea, right? In a pinch. He goes on. Wherever they succeed in breaking in, they must be ejected without delay. Do not forget that here we are facing the enemy which actually caused this dreadful war, who alone bears the guilt that it is still continuing. You all know what is at stake: victory and peace. So I think it's quite a revealing order of the day. Not only does he sort of abandon some of the principles of defense in depth because he knows the position is a shallow one, but he tries to use this resentment and negative feelings towards the British Empire as the country that at the last minute jumped on Germany in August 1914, when Germany didn't reckon with that. German propaganda focuses on Britain more than the other Allied powers as being responsible for the war. And of course, he doesn't refer to anybody here as Canadian, because generally the Germans viewed the Canadian Corps as British. They call them Englishmen and Brits all the time. Sometimes you do see references to Canadians, like the sniper and some others, but mostly they just call us the English. What are you going to do? Right, so what happens on April 9th? Here's this famous image of the barrage, the rolling barrage that accompanies the Canadian infantry as they advance. And I want us to maybe use our imaginations again to focus on who's under that barrage. That's who we're thinking about and talking about here today. Who's under all those little lines, not just trench systems, but people that we're going to hear from in a couple of moments. So, and here's a picture taken from the Canadian perspective now of those shells exploding with the rolling barrage. So somewhere under those fountains of earth are going to be some of the people that we're hearing from today. Same for this famous picture of Canadian infantry advancing. Here's a German picture of a heavy British shell exploding in the ruins of a village around Vimy, not necessarily on the ridge itself. So, of course, when you're in this kind of situation, on the German side, there is some chaos, there is some confusion when the barrage comes. You have the industrial might of the biggest empire in the world crashing down on you, and you're in a muddy hole, right? You're not the Kaiser. You didn't take the decision, of course, to go to war. And you're just waiting it out until that moment when the enemy infantry is going to be upon you. And there's an illustration from one of these 1920s histories here that kind of gives you a sense of that. Little horseshoe nailed to the entrance of that dugout for good luck. Doesn't seem to have worked particularly well in this case. And of course, from the German point of view, during the bombardment, during the rolling barrage, you've got to get down into your dugouts. You run the risk of being buried in there if there's a direct hit. And then there's this moment of panic as soon as that rolling barrage, jumps 100 yards ahead after 3 minutes or whatever the exact timing was. You've got to move, because if you're not fast enough to get up on the firing step, there are going to be hand grenades rolling down into your dugout, and then that's probably the end of you. So one thing I find interesting reading German accounts is that I think for the Allies, the most dangerous concept in our minds as we think about sort of individual experiences, going over the top. You're above, you're exposed, you're outside of the protection of the earth, right? That's what's terrifying. Shelling is too, but the par excellence kind of scary situation is you're going up over the top. Whereas for the Germans, since they're mostly on the defensive on the Western Front during the war, the most dangerous position is underground. It's like the reverse side of the coin, right? You're constantly being shelled. You're constantly underground waiting for the enemy to come from on top and jump into your trench before you can get out of your dugout and defend yourself. So I don't know. I feel like that physical kind of turning things on its head in terms of the men's experience is quite an interesting one. The idea for those Germans in the first few lines of trenches is to continue fighting until that planned counterattack can come and recapture your trench and free you, right? At least that's the theory. And here is a bit of a romantic illustration again from 1920s. And the caption is, "The struggle of the 79th Reserve Division on Vimy Ridge." So this is how they portrayed it to to German audiences in the 1920s. So I want to tell one story from a man by the name of Otto Schröder. He's with the 262nd Regiment of the 79th Division. So up in the area, more or less, of the Memorial Park today. He's somewhere up there in a trench. And on the night of April 8th to 9th, Otto, yeah, I mean, yes, half the Germans were named Otto in the First World War. I know it's very typical, but it's true. It was a common name. So on that night, Otto gets sentry duty. And he finally gets relieved in the wee hours, and he just gets into his dugout and is trying to go to sleep when the rolling barrage begins. And his officer orders him, hey, go into that dugout where we've got hand grenades stored and bring them up to us and do it quick, right? So he rushes down into a dugout where they were storing some munitions, grabs a case of them, but things are happening fast, really fast, right? This is the dilemma, if you're the Germans, is the attackers, the Canadians, they're setting the agenda, they're setting the schedule, not you. So by the time he's lugging this box of grenades up the stairs, he already hears that his officer yells that the Canadians are coming. So he rushes up into the trench, but nobody's there from his section anymore. He just sees one dead German. And he sees beyond a traverse in the trench, he sees what he calls those straw hats. That was a nickname they had for the Brodie helmet because it reminded them of a summer straw hat that used to be worn at the time. And from the way they're speaking and the tones of their voices, he thinks that these Canadians wearing these straw hat helmets are drunk. This is a post-war account, right? So very often you're not kind to the enemy. They're always a little bit mean and a little bit ill-disciplined and so on. So he thinks they're drunk. So he lays down next to the dead German and pretends that he's dead too. According to his account, a Canadian then comes along and bayonets the corpse next to him just to be sure it's dead. So he jumps up. The Canadian soldier says something to him. He doesn't understand what it is and moves on. I suppose he probably said, hey, head back this way and you'll be taken prisoner. But instead, Otto decides to run. He still doesn't know exactly, where the Canadians are up to. Maybe they've only captured his section of trench. So he gets out of the trench and runs. He gets shot in the arm. He runs into another German in a shell hole who's also trying to run and get back to friendly lines. But they don't know in this confusion where their own lines are anymore. They've lost their bearings in the maze of trenches and mud, and they don't know where the Canadians have advanced to. So they find a dugout and they get into the staircase leading down into this dugout, and they sit there to sort of get their bearings, take their breath, catch their breath. And all of a sudden, from the dugout, up come a bunch of Canadians who'd been resting there after having captured that trench. And that was the end of them. Otto and his friend were taken prisoner. He survives the war, and then he wrote that story afterwards. And I think it reflects that confusion, the chaos, just how fast things happen when the enemy is the one in charge, essentially, of setting the tone, when the enemy has the initiative. And of course, it reflects certain stereotypes, right? That, his account's fairly patriotic. His portrayal of the Canadians is not particularly flattering, right? They're drunk, they're bayoneting corpses, etc., etc. He also, of course, mentions that he saw black soldiers behind the lines after he was taken prisoner, which for Germans is, an abomination that there were such a thing as black soldiers in the Allied armies, just out of principle. Right. And the Canadians who he's talking about, who captured his trench, who supposedly bayoneted the corpse and so on, to give us a little bit of a connection, they're from the 3rd Division. So there are people like the Canadian Mounted Rifles, the Princess Patricias, or the RCR, right? In theory. So here we have a few more images that I wanted to include. Here's a mortar operating from behind a little rise. And here we have another illustration of the 1st Bavarian Division sector showing Canadians advancing. in this particular illustration. The caption says the fighting in the area of the 1st Bavarian Reserve Division, so on the southern end of the Canadian Corps line. And here we have a picture from Vimy Ridge where the Germans are transporting a wounded man, not on a stretcher, but just with a ground sheet like that. But of course, it's from a little earlier. It's from May 1916. I want to share another account. This time it's from the top of the ridge, a captain, Hauptmann. His name was Beermann, and he was with the 79th Reserve Division, 261st Regiment, and they're fighting in that Fischer sector where the monument is today. And he's defending a trench called the Berliner Riegel, which is basically the Berlin bar, if you will, the Berlin line. And it has a key defensive machine gun position in it that he's also responsible for working with. Now, this is the area on April 9th where, for example, the 87th and 75th Canadian battalions, 75th, if I remember right, is from Mississauga, 87th is from Montreal, where they have huge problems, right? They almost don't get anywhere at the beginning of the attack, and it's because of people like Captain Beermann that they don't. So here's what he writes about those attacks. Of the first 3 British waves, almost nothing remained, but then there was a stoppage in his machine gun belt, which could not be cleared. Frantic efforts, shaking and pulling, achieved nothing. Having soaked up dirt and moisture for days, the belt was jammed and could not be freed. Shot through the head, Gefreiter Neumann fell, as did the rest of his crew, together with a large group manning the trench. Some brave lads rescued the machine gun and carried it into an adjacent post. To the front, the enemy, who'd been pressing strongly, were pinned down in the muddy craters by the fire of the remaining infantrymen. So I think here again, we have a typical from a defender's point of view. It's life and death if that machine gun belt jams. It's no different for a British infantryman in March 1918 on the defensive, but usually, again, from our point of view, we're going over the top. And it's the German machine gun chattering at us that's the danger. For them, it's as soon as that chattering stops, because something as simple as a dirty or wet belt. That decides who lives or dies, whether it's Captain Beermann or whether it's a bunch of guys from Mississauga and Montreal. And that's what kind of struck me about that account. Another man from the same regiment called Hagemann, he also survives. And this is what he wrote. Our machine guns in flanking positions had a great effect and struck down rows of Englishmen. But the German artillery barrage did no harm to the British infantry. The enemy artillery was very well placed, and as the attack made progress, it was always just a little forward of the British infantry. This and the immediate heavy British rifle and machine gun fire caused very heavy German casualties. So here we see Hagemann, who was an officer, but I didn't note his rank in my notes here. He is sort of giving us an account of what the impact is of German artillery weakness on the infantry, right? So we see that artillery prep by the Canadian Corps and the supporting British artillery in action right here. In the words of Hagemann. All right. So here we have a bunch of German prisoners. This is a Canadian picture during the battle or during the mopping up where they are carrying back casualties. Maybe I'll share one last account. I've minimized all the pictures, by the way, for the Zoom call. So if someone's screaming at me or this is taking too long, well, we'll deal with it after. But I really love these accounts. So I have one more that I want to share, which is from a lieutenant, Lieutenant Bitkau. He was in the 263rd Regiment of the 79th Division. And that's in an area of the 2nd Canadian Division. So that means that the 19th and 20th Central Ontario Battalion, since I guess you're the Central Ontario branch, of the WFA are located. The 22e Régiment Canadien-Français, right? The 22nd, the 22, the Victoria Rifles. These are the people that Lieutenant Bitkow is about to talk about. And what happens to him is, in the very first moments before the Canadian infantry gets to his trench, he's already wounded by shrapnel or by a shell splinter. And he gets hit in the torso. He says, "My heart was like lead in my throat. My breath stuck. Blood ran into my mouth. My strength gave out, and my senses began to dim." So he's sort of semi-conscious. His men carry him into a dugout and put him on a bed. And they go back up, and then the fighting begins. And so Bitkow is incapacitated, lying in this dugout, but he can hear the fighting in the trench above. I mean, that is a stressful situation to be in, right? So here's what he writes about that. More shouting. They're already in the trench above. Then it got quiet, very quiet, until the foreign sounding "come out." There's light. Quick considerations shot through my dulled head. What will they do? Throw grenades into the dugout? If one lands under my bed, I'm gone. Will they beat me to death with rifle butts? It would be better to shoot myself, but the revolver is on the table and I cannot move. Then a Tommy came through the tunnel, looked cautiously around the corner with a big revolver in his hand. He searched the dead and left to bring his buddies. So, of course, if we're hearing this story from Lieutenant Bitkow, he ended up being taken prisoner and surviving his wounds and writing this account for a German book in the 1920s. So, I mean, that account gives you a sense of that fear, of that stress, right? When you're down there in that dugout and the other guys are winning. And of course, he's afraid. He knows that people don't always spare the wounded, whether they're Canadians or otherwise. I mean, Tim Cook, for example, years ago wrote a very detailed article about Canadian soldiers killing Germans in the process of surrendering, which of course was not unique to Canadians. Don't get me wrong, this happened in all armies, but it's clearly on Lieutenant Bitkow's mind, right? And a Canadian private confirms the state of mind, let's say, of the Germans. I mean, they've been subject to one heck of a shellacking. And Private Gordon Little of the 3rd Battalion sees the impact of shell shock on one German who survived. This is what Gordon Little had to say about that German. "One exception was a lone German soldier who was unarmed and in a state of extreme hysteria from shell shock and was getting down on his knees and putting up his hands over and over again. Somebody said, 'Shoot the son of a bitch,' and somebody did. I concluded that not all sons of bitches were in the German ranks." And that is a quote from Tim Cook's 2-volume history of the CEF, which I'm sure many of you own, and which is a great set of books. Let me quickly check the chat in case I'm being warned. Oh no, David says the opposite. Don't worry about time. Awesome. That's what a nerd like me wants to hear. Good. Then, in that case, I'm going to skip ahead to the next picture here. A Canadian photographer that I'm sure many of you know, Ivor Castle, took a whole series of dual portraits like this of German prisoners after the battle. And they're not your usual picture. I mean, this one is kind of your more usual picture. Yes, you see individual soldiers, you see their faces, but not really from close up. You don't have an idea of their emotions very easily. But these pictures I really find are very striking because we can really get a closer look at who these people are, what kind of men they look like. Here's another one, for example, right? So the guy on the left looks a little hesitant, a little sheepish. The other guy looks maybe more curious. Use your imagination, but that's what the human in me feels when I see them. One has a wounded hand that's been dressed. And one of those 4,000 Germans who are captured by the Canadians, was 17-year-old Hermann Kraft. And after the war, he wrote an account of his experience as a soldier at the front, at Vimy Ridge, at that battle, and then being captured. And he left an account that I think is interesting also about, how memory isn't always accurate to history. So I'll read you his quick account, and then I'll try to point out some of the other influences that go into some of these memoirs that mean we have to be cautious sometimes about them. Our sergeant ordered us up the stairs. See, again, he starts from underground in the dugout, himself going first. Suddenly he yells, "Tommies," and fell back dead, tumbling down the stairs. One of our old hands, he was 22, came down the stairs and told us to abandon our weapons and come up, as the position was hopeless and the English were all over us. I walked up the stairs to a huge Tommy who was brandishing a baseball bat. One of the soldiers wore no helmet and had paint on his face and was very fearsome looking. I then realized that he was a Red Indian and our captors were Canadians. Now, it's not an unplausible situation that he was in the dugout, and then before he could even fight, the position was taken and he and the others surrendered. Okay, it's not implausible that someone had a trench club that he thought looked like a baseball bat. Yeah. Of course, it's also not implausible that there was an Indigenous Canadian there because, as I'm sure you know, about 5,000 served. But wearing war paint is not generally something that Indigenous Canadian soldiers in the CEF would do. But if you're Hermann Kraft and you're providing your story for a publication, a patriotic, popular German publication after the war, you have a certain idea about what a, quote, Red Indian is supposed to be. Germany was awash with pulp novels about the Wild West and things like that in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially from an author called Karl May, who everybody read. And you can even still see his books have been adapted to plays. They still put them on here. I see posters for them around Vienna. And he completely had this idea of typical, savages and so on and so forth. And I think you can see that coming through in this account from Hermann Kraft as well. All right. Now, let's talk a bit about the legacy of Vimy Ridge from the German point of view. We all know the legacy in Canada that has become the focus of our memory in a way of the Great War, especially physically in France. We know the birth of a nation theory, and we also know how contested and debated it is, and so on and so forth. But for the Germans, what does Vimy mean, right? If you go up to a German who's interested in history generally, maybe even a history student, and you say, "Hey, what do you think about the Battle of Vimy Ridge?" They're not going to know what you're talking about. It doesn't exist in German public consciousness today. The First World War does, but more limited, because of course it's overshadowed by the Second World War. And at the time, the Ridge is not considered a decisive loss for the German position on the Western Front. It is a strong position, but there was no decisive breakthrough despite the British and Canadian superiority in artillery. So decisive from the German point of view, right? That would cause their line to roll up or cause a major strategic retreat. That didn't happen. They lost a very useful position, but they managed in the bigger scheme of things, because of course the Germans are thinking about the whole front, not just like us where the Canadians were, more or less. They defeat the British Arras offensive, and they defeat the main Allied offensive, which is the French one on the Chemin des Dames. So they stop the main strategic Allied attack. And losing a hill like Vimy, it's not good, but strategically in the moment, it's not catastrophic. However, for Crown Prince Ruprecht, who's the army group commander, so you have von Fassbender as the corps commander, von Falkenhausen is the army commander, and then you have the army group commander, which is the Crown Prince, member of the royal family. He writes, if we cannot recapture a position like Vimy Ridge, and we can't, we know we don't have the strength, how are we going to win this war? Right? So there is a sort of long-term symbolic importance of where the war is going for Germany at that time. This is before the collapse of Russia, right? Obviously, they have a new lease on life when Russia completely collapses, but that's months in the future when the Crown Prince is thinking about that. Because of the loss of the ridge, von Falkenhausen is relieved as Sixth Army commander. He was criticized for not bringing his reserves close enough to the line. They were too far back, so he didn't have time to counterattack. Right, things happened too fast. They couldn't organize a counterattack in time. So he's shuttled off to become the administrator of somewhere in Belgium. Von Fassbender, the corps commander, he ends up being decorated, but for a defensive action later in April for the Vimy group, the Vimy Corps, not for the actual April 9th action or April 9th to 12th action. As far as losses are concerned, here's the very large German cemetery close to Vimy at Neuville-Saint-Vaast. Of course, casualties are concentrated from all over in this cemetery, not just from the battle at Vimy. We don't know exactly how many Germans were killed because we only have records for two of the divisions, two of the three divisions that were involved. We know there were 4,000 taken prisoner, and from those two divisions, 7,000 killed and wounded. So if you add another division onto there, you can kind of guesstimate that it's in the neighborhood of 10, 11,000 at least killed and wounded from a much, much smaller force, right? So as we know, 3,598 Canadians are killed at Vimy, but the total amount of people who are killed in those 3 or 4 days of the battle is maybe around 10,000, for example, which I think is interesting and worth thinking about. And here's what that cemetery, by the way, looks like today. There are 4 names on every cross. I think there's about 44,000 Germans buried there in total, which is a kind of mind-blowing number. Yes, and to give you an idea about the significance aspect, this is a kind of blow-by-blow popular history series. It has illustrations and things from the 1920s again, but they had kind of a day-by-day little chronicle of the war in the margins for this whole series they had. And so for the 9th of April, the smaller paragraph on the left, it just basically says the British were able to push back a couple of our Bavarian divisions, push into their positions near Arras, captured some guns, but there was no breakthrough. And that's it. That's the German summary of the whole Battle of Arras in the 1920s, right? So quite a different place in the public consciousness, right? So here are a couple more of those prisoners. One on the left has been decorated. And finally, for the end, I want to leave you with one final short quote, and I'll tell you who said it afterwards. But here it goes. On the topic of legacy and memory, the fierce battle over Vimy Ridge was fought to a standstill. To be able to call oneself a Vimy warrior was from then on a high honor. In the hearts of the warriors and their loved ones who lived through it all in the homeland, the memory of the days of heroic glory and deepest sorrow glows indelibly at the Battle of Vimy Ridge. That patch of earth has been sanctified by the rivers of noble blood and innumerable heroic graves. Sounds like the kind of things a Canadian could have written about the birth of a nation and so on in the 1930s, for example, right? But it was written in the 1920s by the commanding general of the 79th Prussian Reserve Division, Alfred Dieterich. Now, this is not a typical public memory. For the people who were there, for him, somebody who wants to kind of justify what he did and what the men under him did in the war. See, he calls it a standstill. I don't think that's quite accurate. as far as the ridge goes. But he would argue it's a standstill because they prevented a larger breakthrough, and that was the German priority, operational priority. So you can see this patriotic language trying to give it meaning in terms of German patriotism. That sentiment of General Dieterich doesn't last, right? It's not widely shared. The battle, as I say, is now completely obscure and irrelevant to any German, even those who are really more interested in history, unless they have a very, very specific particular interest. That's why I was always very happy as a guide when the few times when there was a German visitor or family, and one time there was a German military, one or two times German military groups came. I was very excited to connect and try to get their perspective and talk about it, and that's some of what I learned. So that is what I had for you today. I hope that you enjoyed that. I hope it gave you a bit of a different perspective on the human experience at Vimy. And if you've got any questions, if we have time, then of course I'll be happy to stick around.
Oh, brilliant.
Jesse, we have one question in the chat. Will this
Right.
topic be covered in the Real-Time History channel?
Maybe. One of the reasons why I was so happy that Glenn invited me to give this talk is because when you need to make your living on YouTube, your ability to just pursue the topics that you happen to be passionate about has to be weighed against the potential reach of those topics so that the video can actually make you some money. So I would love to do a video about this, maybe on the Great War channel, because it's First World War related. But I would have to convince our producer that it would have wide enough appeal. And I'm not sure we're there yet at the moment. So I would love to, but we'll see. It's on my wish list for if one day we're making money hand over fist and we can all pay our bills and save up a bit, and then we can say, hey, let's have a couple of ones that are Jesse's quirky Canadian things or whatever. So I hope so is the best answer I can give to that.
Well, we drew a good crowd for this one, so I think it's got some appeal. I know everybody was probably as interested as I was to hear the other side of the story, and congratulations on doing that. It was really, really good.
I appreciate that. I hope sometimes it's a fine line to walk. I mean, a lot of us have relatives who were at Vimy suffering, wounded, killed by the guys who I'm talking about, right? By those interesting faces in Ivor Castle's pictures. But I still think it's worthwhile, trying to take a look at the other side of the hill from a human experience point of view and trying to understand the battle and the war a little bit more completely, I guess you could say, with that other side of the coin. So that's how I got into it all.
My great Scottish uncle was the victim of a sniper on April the 3rd at Vimy.
Okay.
And
Maybe
so
it
I'm
was
just wondering,
Gossman.
I was thinking maybe it was Gossman. We have another question here. Are you fluent enough to mine the German and Austrian archives? I think I know the answer to that, but maybe you can speak on your time in those archives.
Yes, I am fluent enough now. Trust me, it was a long haul. It was a war of attrition to get myself fluent enough in German to be able to register for the Masters in History program that I then pursued and completed at the University of Vienna. So yes, I can. I haven't spent a lot of time in German archives, though. I've done some online German archival research, things that they've digitized and so on. But the bits that I've done has been here in Vienna, either at the State Archive or also online sometimes in the Austrian National Library that they have. I dragged up a whole bunch of newspaper cartoons, propaganda posters, and things like that for my master's thesis, for example. So that was quite interesting.
Yeah. We have a question from Ed Walsh. Have you visited Klagenfurt, and are you struck by the similarity to the Commonwealth War grave cemeteries on the Western Front?
I have not been to Klagenfurt yet. Lovely town in Carinthia in southern Austria, but I've not been there. I have, however, had the chance, since I'm not trying to brag, don't get me wrong, not trying to make you to rub it in, but Vienna gives me access to a lot of awesome First World War sites. All the Italian front is, like 5 hours drive away. So I had the chance to do a lot of hiking in the Alps along the old front lines. I've seen a lot of very interesting cemeteries there, Italian ones, but also Austro-Hungarian ones. I think it's interesting you mentioned the similarities, Ed, with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. I think what strikes me the most are the differences, that they're not as well maintained, they're not as well visited, because they don't have the same weight in the successor states' public memory of Austria-Hungary as they do for us in the former British Empire, right? There are not many groups like the Western Front Association in the former Austria-Hungary, for example. Yeah, the interest is not as widespread. So yeah, I also, especially in Germany, a lot of these cemeteries, they are a bit more of the German style, where they have big trees with a lot of leafy coverage. So for the Commonwealth, you sort of have the English country garden philosophy right behind the Western Front cemeteries. Well, not only Western Front, but in general. And then you have these kind of dark, brooding, big trees hovering over these rows of German graves. So, which is more typical for a German style of cemetery, even a civilian one. So yeah, I think the differences strike me sometimes a little bit more, and especially Second World War, they're just mostly mass graves, right? So you'll have a symbolic stone cross in the middle with no name or anything, and then you might have some plaques with lists of names of the people who they know are somewhere in that cemetery. So it's a totally different vibe than our very individualized, very manicured, small Commonwealth War Grave cemeteries, right? Yeah.
Steve Nickel is asking about if you're familiar with Jack Sheldon's work
Yeah.
on the German army, and what are your impressions of it?
Well, it's very useful for me because he, for example, cites a lot from those 1920s books. I mean, I'm able to read them, so I went and looked at them myself, but he reproduces a lot of the chunks that are in them as well in his books. He's done obviously a whole series of them on the German army. My impression is I find it's extremely useful. I'm very glad that those books have been published. How can I put this? I think the way I would characterize the books is that if I were looking for some German accounts and I couldn't read German myself, they would be like, a gold mine of a resource. Because where, for example, Tim Cook, who of course has another purpose in mind, he's not trying to write primarily about the German experience. He will sample a small quote here or there from a translated prisoner interview or transcript or whatever to say something from the German point of view. Sheldon is focusing on the Germans, and he has long tracts of translated accounts. And so I think they're very useful from that point of view.
Dan McClelland is asking, have you ever made trips to Hungary for research?
No, I haven't. I've made trips to Hungary for fun. One time we did hire an assistant researcher to get us some pictures, digitize some pictures from the Hungarian National Archives, but Hungarian is a very tough language, and I know all of about 3 words in it. So she was a local and got us the pictures of the chaotic post-war civil war in Hungary that we were working on at the time. So short answer is no. But one of the coolest cemeteries I ever visited was in Hungary. It was a cemetery that was next to a prisoner of war camp for prisoners from the Russian Empire. So Austria-Hungary captured, I don't know, like 1 million or something Russian prisoners in the First World War. And this one particular camp was in central Hungary. the camp's long gone. There's no trace of it. There's no memorials. There's no anything. But there's a cemetery there. And since the prisoners died, of disease or whatever, one by one or two by two, they had time and resources, the Austro-Hungarians did, to put headstones for them. So that was quite interesting. But the headstones are all different. So you just have a bunch of like Ivan this and Petya that. Some written in Cyrillic, some written in Latin letters. So that's my Hungary connection for the First World War, I think.
I had a question, an archival question. What state are the records from the other side in? I know the victors usually get the advantage in things that survived, and Germany, of course, was bombed and attacked. So what shape are the German and Austrian archives in?
Austrian is not bad, actually. Austrians are pretty good. One of the problems there is the state broke apart after the war, so you have some splintering of what's available. And Austria-Hungary, they had actually their army had three parts, right? So they had one common army, and then they had two sort of reserve armies that were organized and administered separately between the Hungarian kingdom and the Austrian part of the empire. And so you have some splintering because of that. Then you also have some language issues where if you don't know 11 languages, you can't access everything that there is to access. The problem is with Germany. And the reason is the US Air Force and the Royal Air Force in World War II. Because in March, I think it was, 1945, the main former Prussian archive in Berlin was destroyed. So Lord knows how many reams of documents, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, or even more, went up in smoke during that bombing raid. And that's a huge problem. That's why, for example, they don't have anything comparable to what Library and Archives Canada has with the CEF database. You can bring up the attestation papers and the individual file. This is all burned in March 1945. Thankfully, Germany also partly had a decentralized aspect to its army. So the Bavarian Royal Archives in Munich, they have a lot of stuff. We know more, we can know more about the Bavarian parts of the German army than about the Prussian ones because of this. But in Freiburg, there's also the biggest military history archive in Germany, and they have a lot of stuff. I haven't made it there yet, but I've gotten a few things through friends and things like that. What there is in Freiburg primarily. So unfortunately, for Germany, it's tricky.
Yeah, I've given some talks to genealogists about researching British soldiers, and I always have to mention the burnt papers, which are the British records that were partially destroyed in the Second World War by German bombing. And you can actually see the documents with burnt edges all around them. They still have them online. It's a tragedy to think of all that information that was lost. As historians, we just, it's really sad.
Yeah, war sad all around. I think we can all agree on that. But yeah, so that's the situation there. I think Austria a bit divided and Germany lots lost, I'm afraid. Yeah.
If I could just chime in for a second, Jesse, with regards to the resources for the German War Graves Commission, is it status quo? Is there any interest now, or I know sometimes Western Front casualties are passed off to the Germans, but with so many things going on, is there any resources being dedicated to it now?
I can't say 100% that I know, what their budget is or whatever. I was a volunteer some years ago, but from what I understand, there was a period where they got a real big injection of work, of funds. They got a mandate for educational programs, very strong mandate that their work with the war graves was connected with youth programs to connect groups of German youth volunteering to do community work with groups of local, whether they be French or Belarusian or whatever, Italian, that these two youth groups would kind of work on taking care of the cemeteries of both sides together and so on and so forth. So this happened in the 90s. That started, I should say, in the 90s. The Cold War ends, Germany reunifies, the successor states to the Soviet Union allow them to go and start burying bodies, concentrating cemeteries, looking, where was there a field hospital? Okay, we have those records. Let's dig there. Maybe there's 200, maybe there's 300 buried there that we can concentrate or identify. So this started happening in the 90s, but I think now that's probably going to slow down again or be stopped for a while, given the current geopolitical situation and the war in Ukraine. But they were never anywhere close to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission in terms of public profile, in terms of budgets, in terms of what they could do with, how many employees they had. It was much more local and much more basic. And the mandate about what to do about the cemeteries and keep them up, and the mandate about education, the balance was much different than for the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, I think. So
We've
yeah,
got a couple of questions
somebody here
here.
mentions the Volksbund.
Yeah, you saw it. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's what you're just talking about. Okay. And the other question from Robin May is, are German researchers trying to identify German unknowns?
I guess kind of, but not in the way that we are. So there's not this, there's not this government and enthusiast kind of efforts to identify individuals. The Volksbund, so the German War Graves Commission, if they can identify them, they do when they are alerted to a construction site that found some, or where they get permission to dig somewhere where there used to be a field hospital or whatever. Yes, they try to, go into the archives, get the records. Well, who was declared dead at this field hospital according to the hospital's records, if we have them, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, but it's more along the lines of, okay, we've got, the remains of 200 people. Do we have anything that'll let us know who some of them are? Otherwise, we just they do track very exactly, where the bodies were, in what order they found them. They identify that, they give them all a number if they don't know who they are, or even if they do. Then when they put them in a new mass grave, they know where every body was and where it was in the original place it was found. So you can later potentially identify them. But there's nothing comparable to the sort of detailed effort that we put in the English-speaking world.
I just was going to chime in. I attended the burial at Langemark a few years ago there were 80 German soldiers buried there, mostly from Hill 80, but not one was identified. 80,
You see, that's, yeah.
Where are we with questions, David?
The well has gone dry. Nobody's asking any right now. Lots of compliments. Some people had to leave. And Jesse, I'll say it was marvelous. It was everything I hoped it would be, and I've really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks again for the invitation. I really enjoy interacting with real people. YouTube is a fun job, but it's me in a studio talking to a camera, and then that's it, right? So it's nice to see faces of real people who are interested, and to get the questions too. And it's a topic that I really think is worth us dipping into once in a while in the former Allied countries. Let's put it that way. So yeah, thanks again, Glenn, for inviting me, and David for making it all work technically.
My pleasure. And as people are leaving, lots of kudos, and all of them saying how great it was to hear the other side of the story, because we get so much of the same side, and I think you delivered more than 100% on that. It was great.
Thank you.
Dave has asked for your contact information. I can send that to you, Dave.
Sure.
If that's okay with you, Jesse.
Yeah.
Just a remarkable presentation, and you're part of our Great War family now, Jesse. Which
Glad to be.
Can be a good or a bad thing depending on your perspective, but we would
the Central Powers cousin.
And you have a standing invitation, of course, if you're in Canada again, to to drop by and see us.
I come back twice a year to visit my parents. Yeah, so we'll see.
Excellent. That's exactly what I was going to say, David. But I'll extend the invitation to you to present to us again down the road. But we're just thrilled, and on behalf of the association, thank you for your time and your research, your generosity of your time today. Just a great
My
topic.
pleasure.
Presentation was exceptional, so thank you very much for that.
All right, my pleasure. Ooh, I like the silent Zoom applause. I like it.
Yeah.
It's very post 2020. Thank you very much, everybody. I gotta
Thank
go.
you, Jesse.
Supper's ready, I've been told through the peephole. So
Again, all the best to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
I
Jesse.
appreciate it. And good luck to all of you. Bye.
Thanks, Mike. Wow.
So anyway, great topic. I'm just we keep peeling the layers back of things for us. And again, an abbreviated meeting today. Thank you, David, for your wizardry. And I'll just open the floor briefly. If there's any new business anybody would like to bring up, as I said, we have another Zoom coming in the end of February. Some great speakers lined up for the coming year. 3 magazines in the. Don't say anything, David. 3 Maple Leafs this year. But if anybody has any new business they'd like to bring up, we're all ears.
Well,
You had mentioned earlier, Glenn, that we were looking at doing something with the Great War Flying Museum. Is any update on that?
Oh, yes. Thank you very much for reminding me. So this coming year, we also plan a few things. The Great War Flying Museum in Brampton is just a remarkable gem of a facility that very kind of flies under the radar. Forgive the pun, but we have a standing invitation from Natalie McAfee at the museum and their administration to host a meeting there, which we are going to do. So it's just a great place, and I've visited a couple of times, and so we've accepted their invitation. So we will be holding a meeting later spring, and that'll be the venue. It's in North Brampton. So that is in the cards for us. Also, this year we're going to have a dinner. We'll probably maybe do a remembrance dinner. We've explored a few options, possibly at the Royal Canadian Military Institute. We might host a dinner there if we get the numbers, or possibly at the base, the wing club at the name escapes me at the moment. There's an Air Force club in Oshawa at the
near the Interior Regiment Museum.
Yeah,
the 420 wing.
That's it. There we go. That's the one. So we're going to maybe host a dinner there. I attended a dinner there. It was quite reasonably done financially, and so we'll be doing that later in the year. So we've got lots of things going on, and of course the colloquium at Laurier University, a big conference there. We're going to be supporting that. So we've got a lot of things, and as I always say to everybody, you can do as much as you want, or you can do as little as you want with our association. Some people are more active, others are not, and that's why it's such a great thing to be involved with. So,
Glenn, I've got a little plug for one of the other things I do. I don't know how many of the members know, but I do the layout and design for another journal called the Cross and Cockade International, which is a British group of going over 50 years, and they are First World War aviation specialists, and some amazing people. I mean, the chair of the group is a retired Air Vice Marshal with the RAF, and one of the things that we run regularly in that magazine is we have a whole treasure trove of articles written by Stuart K. Taylor, a Canadian who interviewed as many veterans of the First Flying War as he could, and they have a stack of articles. He passed on last year, I think. We have a stack of articles we're still running on him. So anybody who wants to read about Canadians in the RSC, RAF, Cross and Cockade International, we feature one, I think just one about every issue. And there's a lot of other great stuff in it as well, but it's got really good Canadian content most of the time.
Is that for World War II or World War I or both? Or
World War I. It's a
really. Wow.
Yeah, it's a specialist. Been going over 50 years. It's a 55th year now. They used to be called the Oh, I forget the name. It was really long. That's why they changed it. They're now called the Great War Aviation Society.
Alright.
And their publication is called Cross and Cockade International.
Interesting.
Great, but they do 4 journals a year, 80 pages. They run really long articles.
Yeah.
Glenn, don't worry, really long articles. For example, there's one I'm working on now that's coming out in the spring issue. There's a great reference book called The Sky Their Battlefield, I think, by Trevor Henshaw, and it's a reference book on all of the air battles and losses and victories and stuff. It's an amazing reference book, and he has written an article for the latest issue on the increase in the establishment of individual squadrons on the Western Front, and how they grew and finally came to overwhelm the German side because they started building so many planes. So they went from 12 planes per squadron to up to 24. Yes, it's quite an interesting article on how they tried to do that, and that's that kind of detail. It's very knowledgeable stuff. It's really, really good. Yeah.
Garfield has something for us.
Yeah, I just wanted to let you guys know I've kind of been busy with both the Great War Flying Museum and with Camp Borden. And I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but there were a number of original hangars built in World War One, a whole row of them up at Camp Borden. And just this summer, they tore down one of the few remaining ones, which is pretty tragic. But the one, Hangar 11, is actually is a focal point for the air side of the history, and it was built during World War One. So it's a real bona fide World War One kind of site in Canada. The curator and his very small staff have been working like crazy to get the museum redone. I gave them a concept design for them, and they've been working on sprucing it up and getting new displays and artifacts and all that sort of thing in that hangar, because it's the 100th anniversary of the Royal Canadian Air Force. So actually, I don't have my camera on, which is good because I've been busily painting a big large scale model of a Fokker D7 that they have, which is in the colors, going to be in the colors of one of the ones that Barker test flew, flew after World War One. It was a Razor, it had number 50 on it. So I'm actually working on that thing as we speak. But keep your eye on what's happening there. It's going to be, Hangar 11 is going to be quite a focal point for the Royal Canadian Air Force anniversary this year. So I'll have, once I know more, I'll have something a little more concrete to announce for you. So anyways, interesting stuff that's going on there.
Yeah. For those who aren't familiar with the chat function on Zoom, if you go to it, Ed Walsh has kindly posted the URL for Cross and Cockade for those that are interested.
Can I ask a question about from our last fellow that was talking about the Air Force? Do you know if the Talbot Tower is still in existence?
Sorry, is that aimed at me, John? The
Talbot Tower, is that still in existence? It was named after the first fatality in training, a fellow by the name of Talbot. He's buried in the Dorchester Cemetery near where I live. I just wondered whether the Talbot Tower was still in existence or whatever. Apparently it was put up in memory of him.
Oh, I don't know. Is that on the airside site, or is it somewhere else?
It's on the at the airfield at Borden.
Okay,
I was going to say Borden, yeah.
Yeah, I'll ask about that. I don't know. There's actually a few things I wanted to check out. I'll do that because I'm going up there on Tuesday.
Apparently Talbot was the first fatality in training in Canada.
Oh, I'll ask the curator. He's a terrific guy, Andrew Gregory. Quite, he knows a lot about the whole site there. One other
I think we had an article or pictures of it in a previous issue, Glenn, didn't we?
I think we did, yeah.
Yeah.
One other interesting little factoid, which is I just learned about, was that a bunch of Fokker D7s were delivered over to Canada after the war, and some were distributed to universities and all that. There was a horrendous hangar fire where a bunch of them were lost, but some of them were buried. And I've been told by credible sources that they know roughly where they are, and they're actually buried there at Camp Borden. So who knows? There might be a future archaeological dig going on up there, but I think there'd be a lot of red tape I'd have to sort of cut through in order to get that going. But intriguing to know that some of our World War I history is buried right underneath our feet.
You'll keep us in the loop, Garfield, and we'll share the information.
Yep, we'll do.
So in commemorating some of that history, I think the Canadian Mint is coming out with a silver dollar. For those of you that collect coins, I don't, but I saw some notice the other day, $60 or something for a silver dollar, but it's commemorating the 100th of the RCF.
100th anniversary. I was just going to share a little bit of sad news. We lost a good friend of ours, Martin Middlebrook. Some of you may have seen.
Oh, yeah.
Our good friend Martin Middlebrook. He was a good friend to our branch. When he came through Canada a few years ago, he presented to us at the Great War Flying, or the Canadian
Warplane Heritage. Yeah.
Heritage. They hosted us there for 2 presentations, and I had the pleasure of being his host for about 4 days. It's the end of an era. He interviewed all the first day of the Somme veterans back in the 60s.
Wow.
He covered. He was one of the first people to venture into when World War I history started to come back on the radar screen in the 60s. He interviewed hundreds and hundreds of veterans, and he interviewed Karl Donitz, for example, a lot of the German say war criminals, for lack of a better word, but a lot of the hierarchy of the German government. After he interviewed everybody who was anybody in the 60s and 70s, and his stories were brilliant. His research was brilliant. And kind of caught me off guard the other day that with his passing, I believe he was 92 years old. He had 1 million books in print, which is, when you think about our hobby, our history, this passion we have for this topic, to sell 1 million books into history is exceptional, and there'll never be another one like him. So I just wanted to share that information with you. So we're grateful for what he did for the memory of the Great War. Just before I adjourn the meeting, any other new business?
I could just make an announcement. Santa got me a what do you call it? A microphone in a
Very nice.
microphone and a podcast kit. So I've been playing around. So I'm going to start to record. And I have 3 episodes, and they're on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and it's just fun. Go out there and try something new, just to tell some of the stories that I've written, but actually tell them and so people could listen to them on their podcaster and stuff like that. So it's called Heroes of the Great War, and it's now available to you on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or I think it's Amazon's on there. There's a whole bunch of them. It's pretty really easy.
Is there a YouTube in your future, Mark? And should we warn Jesse?
Well, I'd like to do. What I could tell you is that when recording these things, it's interesting. You have to. I do like 10, 15 takes for each chunk, just to make sure the diction's right, the flow is correct, the sound's right. So on YouTube, I'm not sure if I'd be a YouTube star. Definitely not. But I do. I'm having some fun. So that's
yeah.
I'm halfway through the first episode, Mark, and it's very professional. So it's quite impressive, actually.
Well, the third one it's a bit longer. It's about 30 minutes, and that's actually Garfield and I. We were lucky. We had a phone call with the grandson of Alfred Atke, he's the subject of the third podcast, and it was crazy. We actually got to meet the grandson of Canada's 5th highest scoring war ace, and so I actually just I posted the podcast yesterday on all that. Great. So it's have a listen to it. So
okay. We'll get that out to all the members, so everybody knows about it, where to go to find it and everything. So
all right.
And on that note,
I posted on the I'll post it on the Facebook page.
Perfect. And by the way, for those of you that don't know, Mark has taken over some of the communications labors from us and is doing an exceptional job. So thank you for doing that, Mark. That's great. A lot of many hands make light work, and you've just made things even better for us. So thank you for that. Again, I thank you all for your support and your continued membership in our Great War family, the Central Ontario Branch Western Front Association. We'll have a note out to you ASAP with regards to our next electronic Zoom gathering, and as well as a formal announcement for our in-person meeting, likely at the Oshawa McLaughlin Armories in maybe the first week of April. So thank you again for attending today. And of course, thank you to our special guest, Jesse Alexander from Vienna. And I wish you all good health and until we meet again. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Glenn. Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks all. It's great.
Bye.